We have a pretty exciting panel here today. I think because of the diversity as well as the kind of topic. I'm going to try to keep it as controversial as possible, not polite in any form, neither is the intention. As he mentioned, I'm originally from Spain, but I work in India for more than a decade now. Paulo is also from Spain. We have as well as Jake and Timote. Now let me give you a bit of background because, you know, the LinkedIn profile looks very fancy. And, you know, this kind of underselling that they will do, because they will, of course, do a sales pitch, obviously. But we don't want that alone. We want some criticism to come in the picture as well. You all appreciate that, don't you?
Of course.
So, not on my watch while I'm hosting this. Now, let me tell you, Pablo is a telecommunications engineer. Looks good. You also taught at AI for some time, at least as a visiting faculty at least. That's what I could observe. But now you're connecting clinicians in the medical sector, which is quite interesting. On the other hand, Jake, as you can see him here, pretty good looking guy, of course. You can see he comes from entrepreneurship. He did his degree from MCI in Switzerland, in Austria, sorry. He trained himself in the entrepreneurial area. He's an entrepreneur by spirit, not by mistake, purely by choice and by spirit in full, from day one. And then we have Timote, who I first thought was French, my mistake, he's from Belgium. And he did his training in HR and IT, and now he's into the product management arena. Now, as you can see, this is quite related to the topic that we have to deal with today, which is dealing with human design, the product, the company, and of course, the enterprise as a whole. Now, let us begin with a bit of criticism, if you like, or controversy, as we can say. I assume that some of you, if not all, do engage in certain AI-related tools, generative AI, AI being a buzzword today. Now, how do you think really this AI EU Act or related regulations will impact or not the ethical applications of a product towards the consumer? If I, as a consumer, will be affected directly, indirectly, in which way you think? We can start. Since you're Spanish, you will look biased, so let us start with you.
Yeah, well, I think, so I'm half American, half Czech, so I get to see kind of two perspectives on regulation, from the American perspective, which is basically kind of free market, and then the European perspective, which is let's over-regulate sometimes. I think with the launch of OpenAI and ChatGPT, we saw kind of two different approaches to this innovative technology, whereas in the US, a lot of companies adapted it right away and it was rolled out to the market, whereas in Europe, each country kind of took a different approach. And for example, Italy completely banned it. So I think if we want to create an innovative environment, I think the regulatory policies have to be more open. So that's kind of my perspective.
Too diplomatic. Not on my watch. Belgium.
Yeah, I'm living in Belgium and in Brussels, so as you know, we have all those smart people trying to govern Europe in a way. I think that what I see in Europe is that we are kind of defensive and really realizing that we're probably way too late. Now, talking in 2024 about the impact of AI, it's probably a bit missing the train or trying to recatch it. I think that EU has always played a good role in trying to protect and give some boundaries and trying to think where people don't. And I think they are playing their role in trying to regulate a bit the market. But I'm a bit more concerned about the impact of all those technologies on people, because what you see is that we've seen in the, let's say, in the industrial era, that you will have the machinery and others that ultimately help us to really go faster and create much more value, and I'm sure that AI will do the same. But what people neglect is the impact on actually the wage and the salaries, because I've seen people where you say NVIDIA CEO saying people should not learn how to code anymore, they should know how to use prompt and how to use AI. I say, okay, right, great. But at some point, what you realize is that you lower down the level of, let's say, intelligence of people, putting them downward and putting people as a commodity in those areas instead of putting them up. And what will happen is that you will push the wages down instead of putting them up. So ultimately, you create much more disparity between people who are creating those models and the smart ones that are getting more and more extreme because it's getting more and more, let's say, difficult to get in, and the rest of the people. And I think I'm more concerned about the impact it will have on the longer term on actually everybody.
All right. Pablo, since you connect clinicians on the same line, for you, removing bias from products or services must be critical, at least over a longitudinal period of time. Bias can be in various forms, but how will that impact the medical field across different disciplines within the MD arena? How do you think these ethical considerations on technology usage, both for the one delivering it as well as the one using it, and of course, ultimately, the client, in this case, will be the patient. So how do you think that will come up?
Yeah, I think it will differentiate two parts of this conversation because one is how, as developers or companies, we are using AI to have an impact on clients. But the other one is also that the way AI works right now, we have a set of tools, but those tools are owned by big companies like, for example, OpenAI. So in my case, for example, every time that I'm trying to try to see how I can work with AI, it's true that on my side I need to be responsible and accountable for making sure that whatever software I'm delivering is not biased and I'm really helping my users to use the software. But at the same time, there is another part that sometimes we don't speak a lot about this, and it's that what happens with every part of the information that I'm sending to those companies that give me those tools. And sometimes where I'm trying to make sure that my client are making a good use of my technology, I try to for sure be responsible for what I bring to them, but also try to be really careful on how I'm using those tools. Because in my case, for example, I work with PHI, like personal health information, and that's really tricky. Because if I use OpenAI, for example, I don't have a lot of ways to make sure that this information is not used by others in different ways. So I think we should need to see and take a look at both parts of this problem.
It's basically the endless debate on buy versus build, huh? Because when you look at it, is AI a commodity in your process that will not depend on any strategic information or sensitive information, then yeah, sure, buy an API access and just leverage someone else's technology. But if you realize that it's really core to what you offer, you probably will want to build that yourself.
Yep.
And that will make the difference. The danger is that people don't really still think about that because of that hype, and sometimes we're taking dangerous shortcuts, and that's where probably EU is more playing his role, saying, oh, let's hold on a bit and let's make sure that we are creating a safe field. And I think they're playing that role, always a bit too late and always probably too heavy in a way, but at least it forces interesting conversation, and it's probably trying to make sure that there is a balance and then trying to have an opponent to massive player like OpenAI or any other players.
So, since both of you mentioned that, I think we can be in agreement that largely the tech field is an American-driven agenda in many forms. If you have bias, you have that geopolitical orientation to some extent. How do you ultimately utilize those technologies to create so-called empathy from a cognitive psychological standpoint, from the ones who develop it towards the end user, not just in medical field, in any other field that you may work, or any others? And this question can also go to the audience, of course. How do you exactly drive that when there is an inherent bias in the product or the services or the algorithms or the technology, which is, in a heavy way, politically driven as well? Yeah. Because, well, big tech, they're all US-based primarily, or US-owned. So how do you modify that? And how do you twist it to make sure your products are truly inclusive in a form?
Well, I have a little bit of a controversial opinion, so I'll make you happy.
Go ahead, go ahead.
So my company works with early stage founders, and our whole goal is to help these startup founders get to product market fit as soon as possible. And so, like, working with an early stage startup, you don't really have the resources or time to create like an ethical product. It's all about survival. And so, of course, you don't want to damage the world, but you should be obsessed about your users. And so I think it's okay to maybe have a little bit of bias in the beginning when you're building the company, because you're building the product to satisfy this small segment of the market, this specific type of user, and you don't really care about any other users that you're trying to serve a product for. So I think in the early stages, it's just really important to focus on the customers that you're trying to serve and develop the best solution for this small segment of customers.
I would even amend that at some extent, for 80% of the use case, bias don't really matter. Because for what people are really doing with AI, honestly, we really couldn't care less. Because well, if you look at the way it is used most of the time, is really to support business decision, or is supposed to ease some flows, or to faster some manual processes where any bias we don't come and don't enter into the decision. Where you start touching to record things such as medical decision, or when you start looking even about visual creation, that because that's where probably bias really probably will replicate things that you don't necessarily want to replicate. That's where you should ask yourself whether it's the right way. But most of the time, if you're in that situation, it means that you should build yourself instead of depending on someone else's technology.
To add something about what you mentioned, when we are in this startup ecosystem where everything needs to happen like super fast, and we need market fit as fast as possible, I think when we are talking about being ethical or being biased when you took some decisions, usually that's a human behavior. So maybe I think that the approach here maybe is less technical, and maybe we should talk more about how we set up in a startup the culture part of the company, the vision, and making sure that everyone understands, for coders, engineers, or for anyone in product, that they want to understand that every time they are taking the decision, they should understand what's the role of AI in this process and how they can tweak this. But if you don't have this as a cultural thing in your company, and you only focus on let's achieve market fit as much as possible, as fast as possible, probably you're going to end up in your employees naturally being biased because you are not maybe setting this as an important thing in your company as part of your values. So maybe it's a more human thing, and we should treat this as something more cultural.
I completely agree, and I think the most successful startups that we've seen, the founder spends a lot of time really crystallizing what the mission and vision is of the company, what are the goals that they're trying to achieve, and then what are the values they need within the organization to achieve those goals. So I think that can really drive like making sure a company is ethical if the founder cares about these foundational principles totally from the beginning.
So all this sounds great. I mean, nice preaching, no doubt, but can you tell me your examples then? We are talking about removing bias to some extent, or keeping it to some extent, convincing the cultural ecosystem to be X, Y, Z. What tools, what mechanisms will you use for your product teams or your service-oriented teams to really focus on what you're talking about? Because all this sounds very good in theory. But how do you do it in practice without having the big money backing of an MNC or a big tech company that, of course, is easier to do it for them? How do you do it at the startup level, where you are limited most of the times in funds, time, and as you mentioned not to run for it, but ultimately it's a rat's race, where you have to constantly be running after some market, some people, some competition at some point, whether we like it or not. That's the unfortunate part. How do you solve that on the practical level? You may say your examples. If you don't want to, that's fine. I will still keep on poking, but we can try that for now.
And I have a good example of something like that, because a while ago I was running a company where we were in charge of hiring temporary jobs. So we were hiring people for restaurants, stuff like that. And we built an AI software that was able to decide before the candidate reached the recruiter to decide which one to discard or not. And we ended up finding out that because of our client decisions, we ended up hiring some specific set of people, and that was completely biased. So in order to fix this, what we do is we need to work by the founders of the company need to be the good example for those employees. So what we did is investing a little bit more in auditing and understanding the impact of what we did. And that was a good way for our employees to see that we really care about this. So usually I think you need to invest in making sure that you are sharing this vision for how the culture should be. And there is so many things in technology that can help you understand if you are being really biased or you are being ethical or not. But for sure, you need to invest, and you need to be part of your core, so your employees can also see that you care about this.
And maybe to build on top of it, as an early stage founder, the biggest impact you can have on your company, besides having a vision and mission and raising capital, is hiring the right people. And so at the beginning, you don't have a framework or like an entity within the organization that is pursuing good ethics. You have the people that you hire. And so those first hires that you have to be aligned with the values. And then I have an example of where maybe it went wrong with a big enterprise. And that's when, a couple months ago, Google rolled out Gemini. And the idea was really good, right? To promote more diversity through AI, but then they rolled out Gemini, and it was actually lying about things that happened in the past. So you asked it, what did George Washington look like? And he was African American. So like the idea is really good, but then you have to be really careful of how you actually implement it and make sure you don't go too far in a different direction.
And maybe to give you a concrete example, I'm working with a startup, or scale-up in the security industry, and we're looking at how to boost certain flows and improve business processes through AI. And the first thing we've done is really looking at the business value and how we deliver value, and then assessing the risk. And then looking and say, okay, should we want to deliver that value? Can AI really support that? And what is the risk taking by doing that? And then it's not necessarily about bias, to be honest, there. It's more about security and data leak. Because when you realize that there are certain companies, especially US one, it can be a bit rogue and wild on their terms and conditions and how they will leverage the information that you give, you realize that just by giving them certain information, you will feed the system and you will help that system learn. But if you share sensitive information, you are really taking a high risk that at some point someone will do a prompt somewhere and will get access to that information. And that's really dangerous. And I think that's where we have to really think about, not only about the bias, because it's true when you start doing recommendation or you use those off-the-shelf recommendation engine eventually, but also thinking about the data that you own and your responsibility. That's true for security, but that's also true in your case and on saying, okay, you have health or medical information that are highly regulated and protected. How can you ensure that those information won't leak somewhere that you don't control? And that's part of our responsibility and company responsibility, saying, okay, what is our responsibility toward our population? What's the ethical line that we should not cross, and how can we build a process? And it can be very simple as having a conversation and a technical audit, but it's an essential piece of anyone who would want to use those technologies nowadays.
Okay, so let me jump you to two areas now. Let me drive you there, voluntarily or not. One is the regulatory part, the other is the geographical part. When it comes to regulation, first part of the question, you don't need to answer them independently. You can answer them together. You have the AIEU Act. It's a beautiful piece of art, possibly done by people who are not qualified to do it. That is number one. Number two, I'm just dropping the bomb there. You may agree, disagree. That's a bomb. Let's see where you float. Number two is, some will say, some, meaning me, among others, that the Asian moving pace in terms of Singapore, India, China, and other countries, because of lack of so-called regulatory bodies around it, may create in the future more innovative aspects to it or not, whether the regulation supports it or not. As I give you an example, many have compared the AIEU Act to the IATA aviation concept without mentioning that we have learned to put regulations in aviation because of many mistakes that happened through the years. AI as a field is quite old, but as a new development is fairly recent. People have just awakened to it. So on these two contexts, again, I repeat, before you deviate into other areas, the AIEU Act, basically pro, against, why, how do you think that will impact? Because it has overreaching arms. Secondly is the geographical aspect of the new East versus the old West, if you like to frame it in a very nice put way. So how do you think these two arenas will interchange and come across together? Any of you can answer one by one like you have been doing. That's also good.
Yeah, I can start. So on my side, I'm happy that I'm not going to need to be involved in any regulation decisions. I'm not sure if I'm happy, but at least I'm not going to need to deal with that. So, something that I know, like for sure, is that the only way to innovate is by experimenting. Experimenting for sure came with risk and things that will happen. So it's true that if you see like different areas of the world, like something that we always say, like in the US they innovate, in China they copy, and here we regulate. For sure, we should try to find a good balance. But I think it's just a matter of measuring the risk of this experimental thing that we need to do. And if we don't give tools for companies to try things and to fail and to learn, it's going to be impossible for sure that we can reach this level of innovation. So how we measure the risk? Probably is going to, for me, maybe the red line that we should not cross is when this will affect directly human beings. But some other times I will accept that maybe if we play a little bit with the data, for example, it's not that much if we can experiment enough to be innovative. But for me, it's really hard to have a super strong opinion on how we should exactly do that. There is no right answer.
So diplomacy it is.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, go for
I
it.
have probably another diplomat in the room, so you won't be happy.
Oh,
But,
come on, guys. Anybody who is not diplomatic in the audience who would like to jump in, please
no,
feel
but
free.
like in general, I think my approach is less regulation, but more education. Because
Education for whom?
education for the people that manipulate with the technology, and education for the customers that understand, what data they're providing.
And government?
And the government needs the most education of them all. And so I think that's where, actually, we're probably leaning on two groups of people to educate. I would say it's the people in the educational system, like yourself, and then leaders within companies that have influence over the people that are part of their organization. And it's on them to really educate the people on how to work with these new tools and new technologies. And you know what? Unfortunately, the government is not able to do that, so that's why it should be in the hands of us.
We go back to the cultural thing more or less again, but in this case for a country, like your ethic, how ethical you are and the values that...
I think I would challenge a bit on, because I don't think that the topic is really on regulation, because ultimately regulation is a reactive process. Is when something happens, we try to put some boundaries so that it does not happen again. That's how it works, right?
Yeah.
So in any way, this always will arrive too late. But I really believe that indeed it's indication, but it's also in terms of investment. If you want Europe to, and are we talking about Europe and not necessarily a country within Europe, if you want to compete against all those other giants that are really moving fast, it's not about regulation, it's not about, it's about people empowerment and cash that you would invest. Because that's the biggest difference that you would see, how much cash is invested in OpenAI or any other model versus how much cash is, for example, invested in Miracle in France. And if you want to build competition, that's how you should treat it. And indeed, then you have all the brains and you have all the energy, and ultimately the market, and the market's always global, and everyone plays its role. There will be always the challengers, there will be always the one at the forefront, and that's okay as long as everyone can benefit from that. And we already see it, and we are benefiting from OpenAI, from their vision, because they are creating the market, they are pulling everyone into that direction, so ultimately they are playing that role. Now, the question, how we'll make sure that we do not miss the train? And I think that's really the big question.
So I understand that all of you are for squashing the AIU Act. You have not said it, but you have said it. Now, more importantly is, you mentioned about government as well. I also kind of hinted at that. The problem is you cannot let companies drive policy because, of course, they have capitalistic interest in it. Governments, similar problem, untrained individuals. Academia, again, they have their own interest. So what do you do? How do you regulate this? Is a question which is still unsolved. But more importantly is, as the South Summit also intends, which is to create that constant ecosystem of everyone having accessibility to technologies, their awareness. That's why they're doing this massive platform as well as in the city. How do you think this kind of technologies, particularly from the product teams towards the end service consumer, will help breaking these silos? Because right now there's a clear silo of technologies for individuals from the age of 0 till the age of 40, and then onwards, and when you cross the boundary of 70, people are completely lost how WhatsApp works, how to book a flight, how to find the PNR number, even simple things. They're not able to figure it out because they are not trained for it yet. Or there is also lack of sometimes interest, sometimes cognitive abilities at a certain age, which is all right. Now, how do you break those silos in society to create technologies and products that adapt for different age groups? Because you open Gemini or even ChatGPT or any of the platforms, for anybody who is not familiar, it's not that simple. I mean, you may think it's very simple to do prompting, but prompt engineering, if done well, takes training, and you need to know how to do it. Plus, right now, of course, that's in various languages, but it's predominantly a very English-driven platform, though, of course, has other areas now. How do you train that? How do you break the silos in society? Which is what ultimately South Summit wants to do. Break silos in the ecosystem and layers of age groups and societal groups. How do you think that can be done from a product team, startup team, orientation to society?
In 4 minutes, that's really
Yeah, we have some time.
Times it by 10.
He's after my life now, so no worries. He'll be there. He'll be almost done. This is the last question, don't worry.
It's a tough one, right?
Yeah, that's a very tough one for the end, but maybe
Not diplomatic, please.
I think
Enough
that,
diplomacy for
like each interface that's designed is designed for a certain target audience, and so that in itself can create a silo because it's designed for a certain type of user. But I think with AI, there's a thought that the whole user interface will be redefined, and it won't be, a interface that you're interacting with where you're, clicking on certain buttons and performing certain actions, but you're just chatting with different agents that perform those actions for you. So I think that like the future is less of a visual interface and more of a conversational interface, and through conversation you can then tailor the user experience to every single silo and kind of bring people together, maybe more.
I think it's interesting. I had a conversation a couple of months ago with Des Traynor, one of the co-founders of Intercom, and he mentioned that even his company is in an existential crisis because they realize that software as we know them will completely probably disappear. Interface is probably the first thing that will be killed. So there won't be any application, and even the software has to reinvent on how they will serve customers because they were relying on an interface that won't exist anymore. And I think that probably the way we have to look at that is say, okay, we are shifting to a paradigm where interface which was actually the biggest pain into the user interaction will disappear. So it opens loads of doors and it forces us to rethink and say how we'll approach that and how we'll support people in a completely different way. And I think that's down to the DNA and roots of a product managers and then product people thinking those products and really looking at reverting to what you were saying is that we have an audience, we have target audience, how we can support them in the best and most efficient way, and whatever technology can help us should be embraced.